BWI Thursdays. I'm Thomas Frank Carr filling in for Sean Fitz. We are going to talk Penn State football. There is a big game coming up this weekend because it is November, and there's always a big game. Every game's important for Penn State football, unless you read the internet. Penn State and Maryland coming up on Saturday. We'll talk about that and get into some of the interesting matchups, some of the stuff coming up in the game. Also, practice observations on the way on the BWI Daily Edition. Thursday edition of the BWI Daily means Nate Bauer is back. Nate, what's going on?
T-Frank, you got me cracking up already, buddy.
Which part? Because I thought that was subpar, to be honest.
No, I thought it was great. The every game's a big game unless you read the internet. I thought that was, I really liked that because it hit very, it meshed well with what I thought. As soon as I went to ESPN's FPI, right? They have the football predictor, index or whatever it is. But it's a fairly good read, especially at this point of the season from an analytical perspective of how good or bad teams are. And you can look at Maryland and say 6-3. Oh, well, that's relatively expected. That they would be a decent team. But after last weekend, 23-10, that was a dominating kind of win for Wisconsin. And so it feeds into this narrative that Penn State fans, I think, have had really since the Ohio State game of, oh, okay, well, this, they're going to walk to 10-2. Everybody keeps talking about 10-2, 10-2, 10-2. Maryland's like 36 in the FBI. Like they're not a trash team. They're going to come to Penn State. It's going to be a game that very clearly, obviously, they care about. They beat Penn State 2 years ago at Penn State. I will be somewhat surprised if this isn't at least a competitive game. So
whenever we talk about Penn State and this narrative, like you just said, of 10-2 and predicting wins, I'm getting around to this. This is something I talked about with Greg Pickle on yesterday's BWI Daily. Is I'm getting to the point that now I am expecting 30 points from this offense because it's happened routinely this year outside of a couple of games. But would you say that you trust this team with Sean Clifford at quarterback? I would not say that. There's always some weird game. If the weather is a factor, they have been a little off kilter if conditions aren't right, literally, or, the mix up front. And we're going to get into all of these things, by the way, on the BWI Daily Edition, get into some of the matchups coming up this weekend, some of the interesting things for both teams in terms of injury and availability, all that stuff. But the first thing I want you to do, you are the fuel to our rocket ship. That is my message to you who is listening and watching. Help us out. Like the video if you're watching on YouTube, if you're downloading and subscribing on our podcast platform. Thank you so much. We've reached some milestones in year number one, full year number one, that I never expected with this podcast. So thank you so much. I'm humbled by that. Please let us help us keep growing. Rate, review, subscribe. And here's another thing that I think we should point out. The looks like game, not as much fun as you might think. So if you're going to be leaving comments, make them about something other than what people look like, because this isn't high school. Anyway, let's get into Penn State practice yesterday. You were with the defense. I had the luxury of being with the offense. So I want you to go first because I'm hoping you have more than I do. What did you see at open practice?
Yeah. I thought yesterday was kind of loose. I said it in the post-practice notes, and this is kind of dumb because, how can you tell from a 15, 20-minute snapshot? But I think that my read is there is a concerted effort at this point in the season. You're into November. It's the middle of November. Practice can stink. Right at this point of the season, as the player, as the coach, you're just, you're trying desperately to avoid going through the motions. And I felt that yesterday. in terms of the assistant coaching staff doing all that it could to make practice fun. It seemed like the players were having fun. It was pronounced to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, on the defensive side of the ball, the actual information people are looking for. Did not see Curtis Jacobs, right? Got hurt during the Indiana game, only played a few snaps in that game, came out of the game, and we have not seen him since. I didn't see him on the sideline at all for the rest of that game, and I did not see him yesterday. So clearly, an area to be aware of is whether or not he's going to be available, and yeah. I would hedge towards not for this weekend. Tyler Elsdon was at practice yesterday. Didn't see him do a whole lot, which tends to be indicative of guys' availability, right? If they're there but not really engaged very much, then usually you can count on them being at least limited once they get the game time. So that was, those were the two primary factors on that side of the ball. How about offense for you?
Well, as you might expect, I spent a good portion of time with the offensive line, as I have for the last 2 weeks, and it was pretty much what it was last week as well. And this is something I've noticed, the last 2 weeks, is that, Drew Shelton has been getting all of the attention. I asked James Franklin about it. He kind of dismissed the idea, but Phil Trautwein was with him after every single rep. Caedan Wallace was in his ear showing him a bunch of things after every single rep. And, the other players are practicing too, and other players are getting notes, but it just feels like this huge download of information going to Drew Shelton to get him ready for these moments. And it's something that I'm interested in coming into this weekend as a preview of like matchups and stuff. Is there's a week of film now. There's nothing on Drew Shelton before. Now, Maryland, a better opponent, is going to have a better plan of attack. If he's the starter, which we're assuming he is, because he was Olu Fashanu was not there, nor was Landon Tengwall, obviously, who we know now is done for the season.
Yeah.
But that group, there were more people this week than there were last week, as far as like regular starters. So a little more encouraging, although I did not see Salim Wormley going. Same thing as Tyler Elsdon. Didn't see him going through any actual contact, but he was there. He and Caedan Wallace were both there participating in practice. So however that shakes out for the rest of the week, if they start participating, we saw Wormley play last week, so it better sign that he's at practice this week as opposed to last week, which he wasn't. Yeah. So it feels like things are getting a little bit back on track, but there's still that huge left tackle. I wouldn't call it a question mark, but obvious uncertainty of the future.
Yeah, I think the point to make here with Olu is, when talking about Drew Shelton on Wednesday night, right? Just let's follow the dots. Let's connect the dots here. Yeah. James Franklin said of Drew Shelton, they would love to redshirt him, but he doesn't know if that's going to be feasible this season. Well, why? Right? Like,
right.
Why would it not be feasible? If the guy's played in 3 games and you expect Olu Fashanu to be back, then you wouldn't necessarily have that uncertainty, because obviously Drew Shelton could play this week and you would still have that availability for Olu the rest of the way.
Yep.
Read between the lines. Olu is unlikely to return during the regular season, at least. So.
And then you get into the bowl situation, which could be for a number of, situations of still injured, goes to the draft, whatever, that if you don't have that extra game in your pocket, then Shelton, even if Fashanu comes back for the final 2 games and then leaves for the draft, you still have a 5th game that is on the table.
Yeah. And I do think that it's important. Mark Brennan asked a great question last night in terms of leading Franklin into not necessarily discussing the injury itself, but the motive behind Olu's absence, because it's been talked about a little bit, is this precautionary for a draft situation for Olu? Yeah. And Franklin made it plain, no, this is an injury. He's hurt. It's a medical situation. It is not about draft consideration. And so that, Penn State's just going to have to deal with that moving forward. for however long he happens to be out.
I think he would be one that should still play in the bowl game if he goes to the NFL. And here's why. This is a very interesting situation. I've talked about this before, but guys who go to the NFL at 20, and he'll be 20 when he gets to the NFL. There has, in the last, I think, since 2017, there's been one player that's been, in the top graded, as a shortcut using PFF grades in the NFL, one player who's been 20 years old that has performed in the top 25. And that was Penei Sewell, who was considered a generational physical talent.
Yeah.
I think that the play strength and everything talking about Olu when in pass protection, that makes sense. I haven't seen dominant run blocking from him to be on that level. And it gets to it gets even more serious in the NFL. So that time and development, and he won't have a full season of film. He won't have one full season of film before going to the NFL draft and presumably being a top 5 pick. Now, I'm more conservative in these situations, but if you're a general manager taking a guy in the top 5, which is what we're talking about with Fashanu, I understand the physical talent, but there are still unknowns there. So I get the fact that everyone's in love with him right now, but we poke holes in all of these things, and there's 6 months to do it. So every single rep is going to matter and be dissected for him over the next couple of months. And all the love you hear for him now, it's going to be like, well, maybe he's not the best run blocker in the world, and I don't like this or that. Like, everyone loves the tools, they love the pass protection, and that's legit. But I think that there's more that he needs to do in terms of that side of things, and I'd be concerned about that part. But that's just me.
Well, it's also the counterpoint to everyone who is not wrongly thinking to themselves, oh, well, there's no way he comes back, right? He can't possibly turn down being a top 5 pick. Well, if there's a reason to not do that, James Franklin already mentioned the academic aspect that is important to Olu and his family. He's an academic all Big Ten type kid, could be academic All-American. It's also what you just said, is that 20-year-old thing, right? He turns 20 in December. So if he's drafted into the NFL, you're talking about him being really 20 years old in like 4 months, right? When he gets drafted, that's just super young. And so there are, not that there aren't risks involved in everything. Obviously there are, but there are risks to that side of things as well, of going too early, being ahead of when you're prepared to play at that level and to be in that type of an environment. So it's going to be, I'm fascinated to see how that situation plays out, because certainly if you're Penn State and you're a Penn State fan, pulling for him to return, if he does return, and we saw what Penn State's offensive line looked like last week against a bad Indiana team, granted, but you see some of those pieces. You see the elements of, hey, like they could be good up front, like with good, actual good, but also have depth behind it that's pretty good. So, there's a lot of potential there, it seems like, for Penn State's offensive line moving forward.
Yeah. And this is kind of the thing with how everything played out this year. It's a little bit disappointing knowing, I'm fairly convinced that Landon Tengwall wasn't healthy at all at any 100%. Point this season. And you never got that combination of what we saw from Tengwall his freshman season and Fashanu together. I'd love to see that once. I just want to, outside of one bowl game last January, I'd love to see it, kind of in a more fully mature form. But who knows, and then when you, the interesting thing is, and this gets into a fully NFL, and this is very little to do with Penn State, but the conversation around offensive linemen, if you look historically, and I've listened to a lot of podcasts about drafts and stuff like that, offensive linemen have late breakouts. In college, they have late breakouts. So guys that are juniors, you tend to see like that's when the physical maturity kicks in, and they've been in the weight program and now they start to play well. And then when you get to the NFL, there's another lag. There's another 2, maybe 3 years. So obviously, Fashanu had his breakout season. This is his 3rd year in college. That tracks. But the youth and then going to the next level? Are you going to be waiting 3 years for your top 5 pick to play well?
Right.
And then at that point, you're more than halfway through his contract. Do you give him the 5th-year option? Do you believe that he's going to turn the corner in year 4? All of those things become kind of complicated scenarios if you're drafting a younger offensive lineman who is less proven than somebody else who maybe has fewer skills, but you still put in the same kind of bucket. So I think those are also things that are going to come into the conversation at some point with Fashanu. But here's the thing. Talent's the most important part. And he has everything you're looking for in a left tackle. So all of my concerns and my nerdy nitpicking might not matter whatsoever. With this offensive line, do you think that the current construction, like what's your thoughts on how they did last week and how that projects going forward, given where we've seen them already?
I'll just what I'm going to be interested to see is how they manage red shirts, because it's fairly plain that they're going to have to try. Right? I mean, depending on what happens with Caedan Wallace, who was back, but like you said, at practice, not participating. He warmed up at Indiana. Obviously, was there on that trip, but didn't really warm up. There's these levels. We saw it from Kevon Lee a couple of weeks ago for the home game. Right. Came out, was not dressed, then was dressed, kind of went through the motions, but didn't have any actual physical contact, excuse me. And a lot of these, what it appears to me, and again, this is a reading between the lines, but these are physician decisions, right? Like the physicians of the team are saying, hey, you can go to this level, but we're not going to let you go past that. And so it seems like that's kind of the case with James Franklin talking about last week, hoping to get Caedan Wallace back, gets the game time, a doctor makes a call, and that's it. It's either go or not. And in that case, it wasn't. Obviously, James Franklin is hoping to have Caedan Wallace back this week, which would really help, right? Like it would really help them in terms of Bryce Effner's flexibility to provide. You could move him inside if you needed to. If you were trying to avoid a situation where JB Nelson obviously had to come in for Hunter Nourzad last week. We got to see what's up with Nourzad. Nourzad's back for that was something that was announced this week. Nourzad is going to be back for next season for Penn State, which is a big boost, another big boost for the offensive line. Just a lot of moving parts. It seems like a lot of guys. James Franklin, he talked about it on Tuesday of it's not fair to understanding what his policy is and what he would like to do with injuries, and not talking specifically about injuries is all fine and well, but it takes away from, and he acknowledged this, it takes away from the credit that is due to the players who fill in and to Phil Trautwein for making chicken salad out of a situation that is much worse and much more dire than it necessarily seems on its face. Like you have some of these guys who are either playing through injury, clearly playing through injury, or can't play altogether. So that it's just been, I think, a real balancing act. And I would be very surprised if it doesn't continue to be a balancing act, choosing how to spend these games if you're still dead set. And I think that they are, with a certain level of flexibility. Obviously, you're trying to win the game first and foremost, but if you can preserve those red shirts, you want to do that because those players have sacrificed so much to this point in the season in the first place.
Yeah, I'm pulling this up quickly here so we can get an accurate update. But right now, Vega Ioane has 2 games and JB Nelson has 3. So if we're assuming that the situation is Drew Shelton is playing and that's kind of set in stone, those are the 2 you're trying to juggle of, do you play Vega this game so that you can get them both patchwork to 4 if anything else happens with Hunter, who's been in and out with a couple of injuries so far this year, although he has looked better even coming back into the game last week. He looked better than he did when he returned the first time. I think, was that against Minnesota? I forget which game he came back for, but he did not look good when he came back originally, but he does seem like he's healthier now.
He's been banged up all year, you know, and the thing, the exacerbating issue that people don't it's not that people don't recognize it, but it's not talked about, is Nick Dawkins is obviously out for the season. So they're just the interior depth. Golden Israel Achumba, it has not been available. So you just have these, all of the fail safes and the backstops aren't there right now.
Yeah.
Which, maybe you could get by without having to use some of these guys, but they're in a situation now where, you're probably going to have to figure it out. You're going to have to play with it. So,
yeah.
We'll see.
One other note is the last 2 weeks I've been basically with the offensive line the entire time, watching and getting some feel for that. Vega Ioane has been learning to snap the last 2 weeks. And I asked Juice Scruggs about, is there a secret to snapping? Because again, when we get into the Maryland conversation, there's a big part about centers and snapping. And if you get into a situation where a freshman who played left tackle in high school has to snap the ball, what's the secret to getting it down quickly? Because if that's the case, I know that they've got Hunter Nourzad and Juice on the roster, but break glass in case of emergency. What happens when you can't snap the football? He's like, you just got to get used to it. There's nothing special about it, but it's an interesting situation. James Franklin spoke with the media yesterday. Anything from his comments that stand out to you about this game, or because I know we covered some of them talking about Drew Shelton, anything else that he said that you found interesting?
No, not really. I mean, certainly the Khalil Dinkins note to specifically be asked about him, I do think that has been overlooked. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but Tyler Warren he's had a diminishing role and a diminishing presence. I think the assumption is that he's banged up or has been playing through something. He had 5 offensive snaps last week, and the week before that, it was 11. So, where Khalil Dinkins fits in this. And I think, he's a guy that they had some optimism for in the offseason, going back to the summer, as a guy who was physically maturing, mentally maturing, all of that development that you'd like to see in a guy's second year. He was making those strides. So I thought that was an interesting point.
He was not an obvious fit from his high school recruiting. That's one that I'm a little surprised, not that it worked out, because you just never know, but that he has done that so quickly. Because he was mostly a defender in high school, and he was kind of used all over the place as a a slash player on offense. He never really played tight end, so to take to it so quickly and to get his body where it is already, that's really impressive. And we talk about Ty Howell and question marks about Ty Howell, and even there you're starting to see the development. Theo Johnson playing better, and Dinkins seems to be emerging pretty quickly. So these are kind of the nuggets there. What else were you about to say before I cut you off?
No, just the last thing was Tagovailoa. Excuse me, man, I was ready to nail it and then I messed it up. No, just that he's been better. He's with his and you've been a guy. Well, it's kind of interesting to me because you've been a guy who liked him. Right?
Oh yeah.
I mean, I think that you see, and you can see. I mean, certainly that game in 2020, right? He played in and played well, I believe. Am I remembering that correctly? I think so.
It was a lot of short passes. But yeah, he extended plays. He was a quick decision maker and he got the ball out. So yeah, but I wouldn't say that he was playing above his head. There was a lot of Penn State was doing some things very wrong in that game too.
Yeah. But in any case, just fairly complimentary of him. And I thought that was relatively noteworthy. You, however, had a great question at the end that I think he acknowledged, right? Which is, well, you explain it better than I can. So take the floor.
Yeah. So let's just get into it because this gets into the matchup. This gets into Maryland. If you go and look at some of the breakdowns, Talia Tagovailoa has thrown more screen passes than anyone else in the Big Ten. Now that's knowing Connor Bazelak didn't play last week. But Tagovailoa also was banged up for a little bit and missed stretches of games. So this is a team that loves to throw screens. They love to throw screens. And it's not just like Indiana where they throw the bubble screen out to the flat. They do that as well. But they are in traditional screens, set it up with the running back, invite the pass rush, and then throw it over their heads. They do that very well. And these running backs that they've got are better athletes than they've had previously. So how does that change your personality knowing a team wants to screen you to death? And Manny Diaz is as aggressive as he is with blitzing linebackers and with those players that when they see a guy blocking, their trigger is to, go get their man, but that means blitzing. And how do you handle that? And basically he said, like, it's a good point, something you got to be aware of, but ultimately it's built into the defense. The fail safes are already there of you've got your man, and you've got to be aware of him, the tight end, the running back, the whole player who's kind of the spy. They all have to be buttoned up on their jobs. But the point here is don't fall asleep, right? Don't miss your assignment, because if you blitz and you don't pay attention to what that guy is doing and he gives you a false first read, you're going after the quarterback, the ball's over your head, and there's nobody in the middle of the field because everyone else is either in man coverage or they're 10 yards down the field in a zone. So it is something that it's going to be a huge part of this game. And like I said with Greg, I'm expecting some things you haven't seen before. So some screens or some places in this situation, because we talked about regional game. Maryland's going to be up for this game. I believe there's going to be something in the playbook we haven't seen, or in a modification where, they're shooting their shot at the end of the season against Penn State.
Right. Is the linebacker situation in particular, if we're to presume that Abdul Carter is going to get the start, if Curtis Jacobs isn't available, is that the type of thing where that inexperience could come to the forefront?
Yeah, we've seen him make mistakes in coverage all year. So I do think that is something that he's got to be aware of. But Kobe King as well. Both of these guys played a lot last week, obviously for injury. And even if Curtis Jacobs was playing in this game, I don't know it would change a whole lot, because they've been going with that big base. Like, that's now their new base defense is Curtis Jacobs over at the Sam. So maybe this week there would be a little bit more of Curtis Jacobs back over at Will and Jonathan Sutherland out there, just kind of to prevent that. But also because Maryland likes to throw the ball like Indiana, maybe that's what you do this week, because, that's the matchup they like, is having Sutherland and his athleticism. But I don't know that it changes anything, because Carter was going to play a ton of snaps anyway. So it's just about making sure those guys pay attention, because this is something they've seen all year long. It's something I've been waiting for some team to take advantage of, where you get that blitz trigger and then you leak out and there's nobody there. Penn State has been pretty good about this, but it's part of this defense I saw with Manny Diaz at Miami, and I saw how Michigan State in one game in particular took advantage of that. So, kind of historical perspective on it. And maybe I'm just kind of waiting to be proven right, but it's something that, is a part of being aggressive, is that teams will take advantage of your aggressiveness at some point. And that's on Tagovailoa to do, to read that situation right. And we were talking before practice. I don't know that the injury necessarily is affecting him physically in his knee, because he still made a bunch of guys miss and he was still very elusive. But I felt under pressure. Normally he's playing pretty free, and he's doing a good job of, managing that moment. He did not do a good job of managing that moment against Wisconsin. Led to interceptions, led to sacks, led to a lot of bad plays, and ugly, even the ones that didn't hurt him looked really ugly, where he's between two defenders and he basically slides for 0 yards, and he held onto the ball too long, and he's now, instead of a guy that's extending, he's a guy that's not reading and is just running for his life.
He I believe the stat line was 10 of 23 for 77 yards and an interception. Yeah. With I do think he had a touchdown in that game, but no, I mean, it's to your point, Maryland, for as many injuries as Penn State is dealing with at this point in the season, Maryland has some of their own. I believe that you said that you anticipate impacting them in one way or another this weekend.
Yeah, so Jakeem Jarrett is questionable with a leg injury. That's the best I could find on the internet, kind of trying to figure all these things out. With Tagovailoa also banged up, but the offensive line is something I was fascinated by. And I did a little bit of digging on this. So Colin Deary is the new center, at least for the last 2 games. And I am not overly impressed. There's 2 things that you need to do when you're the center. that are pretty fundamental to the play: snap and block. And I did not see him execute either of those at a high level against Wisconsin. The ball was spraying everywhere. And that's another part of the situation last week with Tagovailoa, is that half the time he's reaching over here to get the snap. And so his eyes come off the play. He's late with a bunch of things. And I think that exacerbated the injury situation and his ability to extend plays. The whole situation is Mason Lunford is either injured or was demoted, so they've reshuffled the interior of their line. Janari Branch has moved to left guard, and they've put Deary in. On top of that, the young running backs, Roman Hemby, is not a good pass protector. So that's another part of this situation where Penn State, hyper aggressive, sends linebackers after the running back. He gave up 2 sacks this season and 3 pressures against Wisconsin that killed a couple of plays. So that's going to be something that I think that matchup of blitz versus screen is going to be a big part of this game. And that's another wrinkle on top of that the interior of this line, even though overall it's a very good pass protecting unit, the tackles are good. They don't give up easy pressures. That interior, I think that could be a weak point that Penn State can hammer routinely if they have, especially at home when the crowd's a factor, false starts, bad snaps, all these things are on the table based on what I saw in the weather at Wisconsin. Gonna be a weather game again this week too.
Yep. What about the other side of the ball? What does Penn State's offense need to be concerned with? What does Maryland seem to do well?
They are more than the sum of their parts. I don't have a great read on the defense, because I'm always wanting to watch more film and I don't always get to it because of the other parts of our job. So I don't feel as confident on my read of this team, but instead of being the team that's hyper aggressive and playing man coverage, they have completely changed what they do. They are much more playing coverage. So heavy 2 safeties deep, keeping a lid on everything, and playing cover 2, cover 3, cover 4, and then getting aggressive when they want to get pressure. So one thing I confident in is they do not have a star pass rusher. They don't really have a guy on the defensive line that's going to get consistent pressure on the quarterback. Their Abdul Carter is Jayshawn Barham, who recruiting fans know because Penn State really wanted him in the class of 22. So he's their freshman linebacker. Good player, strong against the run, good instincts. I think he was a former high school defensive end as well. So he's a good blitzer. He's one of their best pass rushers and tackles for loss, all that stuff. But, he's not the starter. The other linebackers that they cycle in, they're good. The defensive line, kind of what they've been historically, typically a 3 down front, nose tackle, 2 defensive tackles, the 5 techniques playing inside shade on the tackle, and they want to stop the run. So I do think that through size and some numbers, this could be a game that Penn State struggles to run the football, especially with the left side being in question.
Yeah.
That being said, I think we got to give credit to Bryce Effner, who's been a good run blocker this year. I think he's been a better run blocker at times than Caedan Wallace. So if you're down to just one guy who, at left tackle is new, then there's a good opportunity for Penn State to break some plays. But this is not Indiana. They don't struggle to tackle the same way, although they will miss some tackles. And the secondary, good players. Again, this is where I wish I had done more before we talked about this. I didn't see any superstars, but I could just be missing some things. There's always things you miss. But they're beatable, like you can put points up on this defense, but you do have to execute and win those assignments more so than they're going to make huge mistakes that give you wide open plays.
So let's do it. Let's wrap this up. Where do you see this one going? What's your prediction for this game? And then I'll give mine and we can wrap it up.
So this is the problem I have is that, and this is I'm going to flip back a little bit. I apologize, because Talia Tagovailoa, one of the things that I've liked about him throughout his career is that he's aggressive. He's willing to risk it to put the ball down into second windows downfield. And that's where James Franklin's talked about being a better decision maker, accuracy improving, is on those plays. He was just a hair off early in his career. And that led to the games against Iowa with all the interceptions. This year, I don't see that as much. It is more selective, but I don't think it's necessarily helping the overall cause. So the aggressiveness, how he's able to escape and keep his eyes downfield is going to determine this game. Because if he can do that and forces Penn State to cover for 4 or 5 seconds, even with a good secondary, that's going to be an issue. Yeah. So keeping him contained and quarterback contained has been an issue for this team. That's the wild card to me. His health and how that affects that part of his game, that and the screens, that's the ball game to me. And I'm coming back to the offense. I've decided I'm going to trust them to put up 30 points. Is now my status quo. Yeah. So I think what it was this week was 35-21 in our official prediction. So that's what I'm going with.
Gotcha. Yeah. No.
How about you?
I have 31-16. I think that, Penn State's defense remains very good, I think. And so teams, when they do get to the red zone, and I do think that Maryland may be able to move the ball with some level of proficiency. Yeah. I just think it's going to be tough for those to turn into touchdowns. It seems like that's been the case all season, and I don't necessarily anticipate that changing, even if they're missing some pieces there on the defensive side of the ball. So 31-16. Yeah. Last thoughts, final thoughts. Where do you,
something popped in my head. I've got more to vomit out here.
Give it to me. Yeah.
Maryland's offensive line, they're trying to run the ball more this year. They're trying to be more balanced and take some of this off of Tagovailoa's shoulders. The running backs are good. The offensive line is not a great run blocking unit. So I think that this is another day that as long as Penn State tackles, they're going to control the line of scrimmage because they're active, they're aggressive. This scheme can do more than Indiana, so they can make Penn State exchange gaps and be wrong. They do have that part of them, but I don't know that they're so proficient at it that they're going to get Penn State. And Penn State, by the way, they really improved since the Michigan game with that particular thing, but It is on the table. Everyone's tried it since then, except for Indiana, because they just physically can't change their scheme. Like they're incapable of doing anything different. So that's another part that I'm looking at, but I'm pretty confident that Penn State's going to be able to control that part. So that's my last thought. How about you?
No, I'm going to be interested to see what how these look like. Injuries, people don't like to acknowledge for some reason. It seems to be part of the psyche of fandom to just assume that the next guy, whoever the next guy is, will not be a massive drop off. And that's just not reality all the time, right? Like there's starters are starters for a reason. And sometimes depending on when it happens in the season, where it happens on the field, it can take a wide ranging impact, right? In terms of what happens to Penn State's identity, what they want to do, what the defensive coordinator, offensive coordinator, all those guys feel comfortable with. It's just a domino effect of how Penn State looks when those things happen. And especially in a situation like this, where it's not just one guy, right? Yeah. Like if you lose one player here, one player there, sometimes you can hide that and erase that and make up for it. But it does seem to me as though Penn State is dealing with a rash of things right now, which would lead me, it would lead me to believe that maybe this one is a little bit uglier than Penn State fans would necessarily enjoy. So
this is why we always go an hour when you and I talk, because you triggered something that I wrote already at bluewhiteillustrated.com that you can anyone can read. It's in the depth chart talking about how the tight ends and receivers and how they've used those over the course of the year have changed. And it's like, just go check it out there, because we've talked for enough here, and you need to go to the site, sign up for $10 and get from now until football season for premium access. But anyone can read the depth chart, share it with your friends, so everyone knows that JB Nelson is now number 56. And we've got that information for you on lockdown. I'm Thomas Rankar. That is Nate Bauer. We're done today on the BWI Daily Edition. Best bets, recruiting information. It is going to be a heavy show coming up tomorrow on the Friday edition. We didn't get to our Tuesday recruiting show. We are going to get to that information on Friday with Ryan. So make sure you subscribe, download, rate, review, 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, all that stuff. I know that this postscript you're not listening to, but it is very important for you to help us out. And it is the one thing we ask of you other than, subscribing everywhere that we do things. So we'll be back tomorrow. And until then, we'll talk to you later.